This beautiful dress was designed by the Mexican potter Diego Valles, and its inspiration was the Mexican potter Mara Ortiz, the line designs that she created on her pottery. However, I've seen these sorts of linear designs from fashion designers all over the world, and it inspired me to create my own. How to design a dress with a rhythmic line pattern on the fabric. I'm going to go over the different types of points of marker. This is what's called a wedge tip. Let me see if I can zoom in on it. It's got a square end. Okay. And this one is called a brush tip. It looks like a paintbrush at the end. It's a good idea to always check the points of your markers. This is what it should look like. Okay, so this one might still have ink, but I wouldn't use it for line work. You can see the difference. They're the exact same type of Sharpie. This is a thin Sharpie, and I would say that it's in good condition. The only issue with this Sharpie and this type is that they tend to spread. The type of ink tends to spread out on the paper. So here's our brush tip. This is a very ultra fine point marker. Slightly fatter line. And you can see the brush tips are very similar, but this one's a little thicker and this one's a little thinner. So what we're going to go over is the different types of lines you can make with all these markers. You can see that I've already previously drawn this image. And you can see that I deliberately left my erasure showing, just to show you that artists, especially on YouTube, tend to make things look very, very perfect and to draw stuff very quickly. And you have to understand that in those cases, they had previously drawn the image many times. There was a lot of practice involved in order to get to that point, and we, as human beings, generally do not draw totally perfectly the first time. People make mistakes. That's why pencils have erasers. So that ability to erase and redraw your work is very, very, very important. And you shouldn't let your typical YouTube tutorial intimidate you, because a lot of times those tutorials are really just designed so the artist can show off their skills and not to actually teach you anything. Now, that being said, I previously drew this design just for fun, shaded in a little with pencil just to show you the idea of what a rhythmic line design is supposed to look like. And now I'm going to see if I can translate that to fabric. Now, the idea is that you have to think about the way the fabric drapes, and you also have to think about if you were actually drawing on a real three-dimensional surface as opposed to drawing on a flat surface. So a great way to practice this is to take a three-dimensional surface and actually just draw on it. So I've actually spray painted this can. So again, this is very sloppy because it's drawn over this sort of gloppy spray paint, but the idea is that the more I draw, the more fluent my lines become. You can see how the beginning ones are kind of halting and scribbly, and the later ones have this fluidity to them. So that's what we're looking for, that fluidity. So I would always practice on a separate piece of paper first. Now I'm going to use looking for a brush point. Yeah, there. So I'm going to go over these kind of sloppy lines and see if I can make them look more interesting. So always keep in mind that art is about what it looks like. So if it does not look good, it is not good. So this does not look good. I have to make it look good. One of the ways that I'm going to make my art look good is I have to have the lines taper off at the end. I don't want them to end abruptly. And the brush on this is actually very useful for that. So I'm going to show you why and how it's useful. Let me just redo the focus so that I'm up close. Okay, so if I hold my brush high above and I use my pinky to rest my hand, I can get thinner lines. If I want to press a little harder, I can get fatter lines. So notice how I'm steadying my hand using my pinky. The other thing you're going to notice is how I hold my brush. It's almost like I've got an egg in my hand. Notice how I completely control the width of the line by laying the brush down on the side to get a thicker line and lifting it up all the way to ballerina tiptoe point to get a thinner line. So I have absolute control over the width of the lines, and I'm making them taper off at the very end. All right, so we have gone over the brush tip, and now our next point of interest would be the wedge tip. So the wedge tip is nice because it can make very thin lines if you do it this way, and much thicker lines if you work with it this way. Okay, so we're going to be playing around with that. So as you can see, I can take my brush, well, my wedge tip, and make a fat line or a series of fat lines by just pulling down with the fattest line, and then without turning it, make a thin line, thick and then thin, almost like a staircase, without turning the marker. So that can make an interesting series of lines. And as I said before, rhythmic lines, think about it like a road. They're going to follow each other, and the space in between them becomes even, and that creates a rhythm or pattern. Now the idea is that you have to be very, very, very intentional in your design. So you don't want to just randomly scribble for this type of design. There are other types of designs where random scribbling might be part of the process, but not for this assignment that I've given myself. So again, thicker and then thinner. So if you want to turn now in this case I didn't turn the wedge, I just kept it going in the same direction. So this made a thin line and that made a thick line. If you want to turn it, you can make sort of a very interesting calligraphic line. Calligraphic like calligraphy, like fancy writing. So if I turn the brush or turn the wedge, you can see how the line almost looks a little bit like a ribbon in space. It's got that sort of thin and then thick and then thin and then thick again. So let me show you that again. You'll notice I'm turning it. But I'm being very experimental about it, and it doesn't look particularly good. So remember, art is about what it looks like. If it does not look good, it is not good. So I have to make this good. I have to fix it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very intentionally make certain parts thicker and very intentionally leave certain parts thinner. The other issue that I have is how the line ends. That looks terrible. That is bad because it just stops abruptly. So what I want to do is I want to make it look like I meant to make it look a certain way. So I'm going to have it taper off. So that looks much better. And you can see it's got an intentionality about it that it didn't have a minute ago. I mean, if you know, if you're any sort of artist at all, you can definitely see that one looks better than the other. You know, there's a you almost have to get in the zone where you're not even thinking about it, and you let your fingers flow, and you get that sort of very relaxed feeling. You have to give yourself time to get to that point where you sort of start to know what you're doing and how you want it to look. And you're going to make lots of mistakes, and that's fine. You just cover over them. There's nothing wrong with making something that looks terrible as long as you can figure out a clear path to making it not look terrible anymore. So one of the things that I did was I very intentionally managed the width of the lines. And as you can see, this is not quick. It's taking me a while. That's the other thing you need to understand about a lot of these YouTube tutorials is that the artists will speed up the video so that the audience doesn't look bored. But at the same token, that means that you get this idea that these people are painting or drawing very, very quickly. Now, look, I accidentally almost used the bad marker that somebody had pressed on too hard. So let me pick the good point, and now let's talk about, this is a fine point. It's called the fine point Sharpie, and this one would be the ultra fine point. So we're going to use the fine point first, and we're going to actually use it to fix up these lines a little bit. So again, I use the fine point very similarly to how I use the brush tool. I'm laying it down on its side to make a fatter line and lifting it up on its ballerina tiptoes to make a thinner line. So again, the whole process is extremely intentional. And if it does not look good, you have to be honest with yourself that it doesn't look good. And you have to figure out a way to fix it. Nobody knows what you plan to do at first, so changing it so that it looks more interesting, and it definitely looks a lot more interesting than it did a few minutes ago, is part of your job. Now, if you look here, you'll see all these fingerprints and smears because I touched the ink when it was not quite dry. So now it's sort of my job to make this whole thing look like I did that on purpose. So I'm kind of going around my fingerprints, and I'm playing with them. And you know, there's an old expression, Leonardo da Vinci once said that art is never finished, it is merely abandoned. So you could keep doing this really literally for hours. You could make an entire masterpiece out of this. Fortunately, I'm just using it as a demo. So let me go through to the ultra fine point. Now this, I think, is a little too thin for this design. So let me find a slightly thicker point, and I think I'm going to go with the ultra fine Sharpie, which I said one of the drawbacks of the Sharpies is they do tend to spread when you're using them on paper, but they seem absolutely fine when using them on a spray painted soda can. So as you see, I am going over this round curved surface. I'm playing around with my little fingerprints and making it look like, yes, I wanted that part to look gray. And I'm also making these little roads. So if you make one line, make 5 or 6 lines next to it to make it look like it's part of a pattern. I've heard these types of designs called Zentangles, but that's a trademark term that one calligrapher made because her and her husband were selling these books with these very specific sorts of designs. And the reality is these sorts of rhythmic line designs existed way before anybody copyrighted the term Zentangle. And unless you've gone to one of their Zentangle courses and you've become a certified Zentangle instructor or whatever they call it, it would be inappropriate to call any of these lines Zentangles. You see them in ancient Egyptian designs, in ancient African designs, in ancient Native American designs, in ancient Mexican designs, so both North and South American. So there is absolutely no way that you could call this a Zentangle. Just call it a rhythmic line design, unless you are very specifically following a Zentangle book, or you took a Zentangle class or something. So I just think it's disingenuous to call every single rhythmic pattern line design Zentangle. That it's something that a lot of our teachers tend to do, and I find it annoying. All right, so I think I've gone over the different types of wedge tip, brush tip, fine line, and ultra fine line markers, and now it's time for me to decorate my fashion model. Now that I know how to draw my designs on a curved surface, I'm going to see if I can imagine a curved surface on my drawing of my model. Before we start drawing on the actual dress, let me just quickly review the different types of markers and how they affect how your drawing ultimately will look. The different types of pens. There were brush pens. There were very, very, very thin kind of micron pens. There are Sharpies. There are ultra thin Sharpies. And there are wedge tip or calligraphy pens. So we're going to put this micron pen aside. It's too thin for this project. I'm not going to use that one. And we're going to make absolutely sure that if we use a Sharpie, that it is a nice sharp point. You can see this one doesn't, so we're getting rid of it. Obviously somebody pressed too hard on it. And instead of the regular Sharpie, I like these Sharpies. They're called Sharpie pens, and they have a slightly sturdier point than the ultra thin. So I'm going to get rid of the ultra thin and use a Sharpie pen. Also, the Sharpie pen has a little bit less of a tendency to spread. So these are the types of markers I'm going to be using for this project. If you are not using a marker, you always cap it firmly with a click so that it doesn't dry up. And I believe I will be starting off with the Sharpie pen and the wedge tip. So these are the ones that I will use. So the other thing that I'm going to be using is a pencil. And you can see that this dress, I didn't finish drawing it. So let me just do that right now. You always have to be mindful of the direction that your lines take. Don't color in like you're coloring in a coloring book. So the directions the lines take are very, very, very important. think about the folds of fabric and how what the fabric would feel like when it's swishing against your body. And you see how by making these up and down lines, it gives the picture a sense of dimension. The other thing you might notice is that I always try and draw somewhat lightly, and then I go back and darken in the lines later. That's because I also tend to erase a lot if I don't love what I'm doing. So there's the back part of the dress. And now I'm going to start with the shading. So if you think about dark and light, what I do is I press and then I lift with the Sharpie. I also follow the form, the three-dimensional form of the fabric. And that's where me drawing on this soda can yesterday as practice comes in handy. Think about drawing on a paper towel roll, a toilet paper roll, anything round or cylindrical, and how it's impossible not to curve your lines if the surface that you're drawing on is curved. If you want to make your drawings have a realistic feel, and then the other thing is lifting your pen slightly as you draw, so that the heavier mark is at the darkest area and the lighter mark, see how it tapers off? Okay, if you hold your pen at the same weight, the line is boring. But if you lift slightly and it tapers off, it has this intentionality to it. You're going to hear me talking about that a lot, that intentionality. I intended to make it look round, so I used this type of mark. The other thing is, fabric has a warp and a weft. Okay, a warp are the lines that are on the loom going up and down, and the weft are the lines that weave in and out of the warp. So it's ideal for cross hatching. So cross hatching is where you shade using lines in two different directions, and it actually will look like fabric. And that's what I'm doing now. This is cross hatching. The other thing is, notice that I'm not drawing so carefully. I'm actually using fairly quick, confident shading. Once you get into it, you do tend to draw a little faster, but the nice thing about it is that your mark making takes on a more personal style. You get this confidence about your drawing, and it really has the feel of, I feel the fabric undulating. But this is the type of thing that only comes with careful planning. I sketched on a separate surface first. Remember the soda can I sketched on yesterday? And I drew the whole thing first. I did a lot of drawing. I did a lot of erasing. I did a lot of planning. And so when I finally get to do the shading, there's a freedom in it that wasn't there, that wouldn't have been there if I hadn't done so much planning on the front end. The other thing that I want to explain is that nobody is actually born knowing automatically how to do this. The people who draw well also draw a lot. So the other thing I want to talk about is the light source. She's a model, and I'm assuming she's walking down a runway. So I'm going to place the lighting as above her, and also the lighting as towards her. So if she's lit from the front and she's lit from the top, then things underneath her and things on the edges will be shaded more, and things in the front will be shaded less. So that's going to emphasize every fold of the fabric. Notice my lines are getting a little more scribbly. All right, now I've got a job here with the heavier lines down here. So for this, I'm going to use a slightly heavier marker. And this one is fatter than this one, as you can see. I don't know what type of condition it's in though, so let me just scribble on a separate pad. And it looks like it is dry, so I'm not using it. Let's see what else I got. You know, I think I will use this Sharpie. It makes a slightly darker line. It's a little bit less pen-like, a little bit less marker, more marker-like. So you can see it makes a heavier mark. And I think what I'm going to do is I'll use this, nope, not this one. I'm going to use this Sharpie. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out where it's going to be extremely dark. And I'm placing those very dark marks here. Now it looks wrong, but it won't for long. I'm starting at the dark mark and I'm going out. I'm also flaring it a little. And I'm making it densest right up where the darkest marks are so that it kind of fades out. And now I'm going to go with a thinner Sharpie pen and pull it out with even thinner marks. Now, I personally find this type of drawing very, very, very relaxing. I just sort of get into the zone, and it's almost like I can feel the fabric underneath my fingers. I'm imagining how the fabric feels. But there's a lot of practice drawing that comes with, before you get to this point where it's actually relaxing to do. If you take a piece of paper and you curl it and you put it in front of you, and you try drawing and shading that, and then you take a piece of paper and you crumple it and you try drawing and shading that, there's a lot of exercises you can do on your own where you actually can practice drawing textures and shadows and stuff, and I highly suggest that you do some of that. So all the types of things that you would learn to do in Foundations of Art, in a Foundations of Art class. So if you ever have an opportunity to take Foundations of Art, I think that you'll be very happy with how your drawing ability grows. I think that Foundations of Art and Drawing and Painting 1, Drawing and Painting 2, a lot of those classes, people ignore the basics because they want to get to the fun drawings. Everybody wants to do the fashion drawings or the drawings of fast cars and things like that, but they ignore the foundation that helps you to get there. Now, this next section is very much sped up. We're taking about 16 minutes worth of video footage and we're compressing it down to about 4 minutes. Just mainly because I wasn't talking when I was drawing this, so there wasn't any actual reason to keep it at the original length, and I didn't want my audience to get bored watching me draw. But the idea is that I followed the three-dimensional form of the of the fabric. If you have trouble doing that, do a lot of practice drawing on toilet paper rolls. They're free. Everybody has them. And just get into the, as you can see to the left, I did some practice drawings ahead of time. The other thing, though, is Pablo Picasso once said that if you know exactly how a picture is going to end up, there's no point in doing it. So you're going to have surprises. You're going to have unexpected things, and you're going to have to invent as you go along. No piece of artwork is ever perfect. So this original spiral that I am creating now that you see, it didn't stay that way. Eventually, parts of it got filled in, different lines got thicker. I was making it up as I went along. And as much planning as I did at the beginning of this project, you're going to see me making it up as I go along, because if it's too planned out and I know exactly how it's supposed to look, I get bored and I don't finish the project. So some planning is key. Too much planning can actually be a creativity killer. You have to have that freedom to just create. And while I was creating this, I wasn't talking at all. I wasn't making a sound. I could have been easily playing music. I was just in the zone of doing what the picture told me to do. So this is, what I came up with, and I'm going to show you a few process photos afterwards. So I just kept stopping and then coming back to it and looking at it and changing it. So I darkened in certain areas, and then I came back and I darkened in yet other areas. And I'm still not done with it. But I feel as if I can stop my tutorial here because you get the overall idea, and I can't wait to see the designs that you come up with using this process.